Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 433. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about the war in Ukraine. A lot of important news developments there, so be sure to share the show today. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. You can find the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to podcasts. If you're a new listener, just be sure you subscribe to the show. If you're a longtime listener, ratings and reviews are helpful, but the best thing you could do is just recommend the show to new listeners or put it out there on your favorite, Twitter, Facebook, whatever you like to use. Put it out there. Let people know where to find the show and give it a recommendation. And thank you very much to everybody who does that. We continue to see growth with the show, and that's because y'all are participating and helping us out by recommending the show. Now let's get into it. The first story today from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Republican senators introduce Endless Wars Act to repeal 2001 AUMF. So this is some good news. A group of Republican senators on Thursday introduced a bill to repeal the 2001 authorization for use of military force that was passed in the wake of September 11th attacks and is still being used to justify wars today. The Endless Wars Act was introduced by Senators Rand Paul, Mike Lee, J.D. Vance, and Mike Braun. The legislation would repeal the 2001 AUMF 180 days after its enactment. And this is from a press release from Senator Paul's office. If there is a desire to reclaim our constitutional powers and send a message to the world that we are a nation of peace, Congress should pass this bill and repeal the 2001 AUMF. After all, the 2001 AUMF never intended to authorize worldwide war all the time, everywhere, forever. Senator Lee said, because the 2001 AUMF has become one of the many instruments of misuse, and it is time for members of Congress to end this authority that keeps us in endless wars. Senator Braun added that no president should have the authority to single-handedly wage war and called this return to the power of the people and to repeal the authorization that has outlived its purpose. The 2001 AUMF currently authorizes war in Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, and several other countries. There has been a push in Congress to repeal the legislation and also the 2002 AUMF that was used to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but that authorization is not in use today, and repealing it won't end any current wars. In March, the Senate voted to repeal the 2002 AUMF and the 1991 AUMF that was used to justify the Gulf War. At the time, Senator Paul attempted to include an amendment to the legislation that would repeal the 2001 AUMF, but it failed on a vote of 9-86. So, given that, I don't think it's likely that this legislation is going to pass. I am curious as to what this vote looks like because it may be a momentum building vote. And there's always the possibility that if you get enough people out, 30, 40 senators is probably closer to that threshold, especially if you have at least a few from the other party. And so in this case, the Democrats, it does start to create some political pressure. And this isn't a solution, right? This hasn't ended the war in Yemen to have votes getting closer and closer to condemning it. However, it did cause the U.S. to have to repeal and pull back some of their support for the Saudis. And so I don't think that, this is necessarily a bad thing, even if it fails. It could cause the White House to say, well, maybe we should carry out a smaller number of drone strikes in Somalia, because the more attention that's paid to it, the more attention that's going to build for, say, this legislation or for Matt Gaetz's legislation that calls for ending that war. And so they just do less. And even though there may be the war is still going to go on, it's not going to end the war, but it may make it somewhat less devastating. So let's hope this goes through. And of course, Rand Paul leading this effort is awesome. And it's Rand Paul at his absolute best. Now let's move on. And this article I wrote for antiwar.com on June 9th. Biden administration announces $2.1 billion weapons package for Ukraine. The Department of Defense announced on Friday it will purchase $2.1 billion in weapons for Ukraine, including munitions for the Patriot and Hawk air defense systems. The weapons to be purchased include additional munitions for Patriot air defense systems, Hawk air defense systems and munitions, 155mm and 203mm artillery rounds. And I thought the 203mm number sounded a little bit different. I don't see that a whole lot, and I think these are for older Soviet systems, where the 105mm, I believe, is for the Bradleys and probably other artillery as well. But just some notes there. Puma unmanned aerial systems. Those are small, I think like lightweight, 4 feet wide, 20 pound, 25 pound surveillance drones, laser guided rocket system munitions. And so I'm guessing these are either TOW, AT-4, or Javelins, but they don't specify. And then an additional portion of this money is for support for training, maintenance, and sustainment activities. The weapons are being purchased for Kiev under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. That's the USAI. The Joe Biden administration has primarily relied on the Presidential Drawdown Authority, the PDA, to ship arms directly from U.S. stockpiles to Ukraine. Weapons provided under the USAI could take months or even years to be delivered, as they involve contracts that may need to be and might need to be manufactured. This is from the Pentagon press release. This announcement represents the beginning of a contracting process to provide additional priority capabilities to Ukraine. This USAI package illustrates the continued commitment to both Ukraine's critical near-term capabilities as well as the enduring capacity of Ukraine's armed forces to defend its country and deter Russian aggression over the long term. A Pentagon fact sheet claimed the U.S. has now committed $39.7 billion in security assistance to Ukraine alone. However, in a February report published by the Kiel Institute said the American military had already shipped $45 billion in weapons to Ukraine. So I think that's some pretty fancy accounting that the Pentagon is using to get that number so low. Now, there's always these questions too of what percentage of these weapons are actually reaching the front lines, where they're ending up. And those are all fair questions. And of course, as we'll get into, some of that, about $40 billion that the Pentagon has calculated, are weapons that are being purchased from American arms makers, and some of those, have to be manufactured. And so, to say we've committed or have even purchased $39.7 billion in weapons for Ukraine, and that number does include some training and maintenance and things like that as well. But that doesn't mean necessarily there's $39 billion in weapons actually physically in Ukraine or that have been shipped to Ukraine. So for fiscal year 2023, Congress authorized the White House to spend about $18 billion through the USAI. The Pentagon announcement now has that total at $10.8 billion in arms purchases this year for using the USAI funds. And so they have another, I guess, $8 billion, $7 billion, $7.2 billion is the total there to spend on weapons purchased for Ukraine. Now, I'm sure that this is a part of the strategy that Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State, laid out in his speech in Finland, and we covered this extensively last week. I wrote an article on it where Blinken said that, we're really not interested in talking right now. We're interested in helping Ukraine to develop and build a modernized NATO military. And so I'm maybe these Patriot systems that are being purchased through this package aren't even expected to reach the battlefield when there's still a battle going on. That this is long-term assistance intended to make sure from the White House's perspective that, Ukraine has a military that's capable of defending Ukraine's borders. Now, I don't think that's necessarily possible, but that, that I think is the strategy, and that this is how this fits into that strategy. All right, so a conflict of interest looming over the purchase of the weapons in this package include that Secretary of State Lloyd Austin previously worked with Raytheon. The arms industry giant manufactures the Patriot interceptors the Pentagon plans to buy. 60 Minutes recently interviewed a former contract negotiator, Shay Assad, who warned the companies were exploiting the war in Ukraine by price gouging the U.S. government. Assad pointed to Raytheon making a 40% profit on Patriot munitions. The company also lied about the cost and time involved in building radar equipment to build the Patriot systems, according to the former Defense Department employee. And so we're talking billions of dollars right here, right? We're billions and billions and billions of dollars. You know, 2, 3, 4 billion. I don't know how much, is total the U.S. has spent on the Patriot missiles for Ukraine at this point, but I'm sure it's multiple billions of dollars. And the Secretary of Defense, the person who's in charge of the organization, who's ordering those weapons to be sent to Ukraine, who is, the head of the negotiation, the organization that's negotiating with Raytheon, is a former Raytheon employee. We have a former Department of Defense employee saying that, hey, this country is making excessive profits on this particular platform, and there's no demand from the people of the United States to at least look into this. It's not even a concern that's brought up or mentioned in our media. I'm sure that I am probably the only person who covered this weapons package that wrote that in their article. And that's a massive problem, that we have to deal with. The level of corruption in the United States is just absurd. Now, I think one of the reasons they're able to get away with that corruption is because they've embedded this narrative that Russia is bad and we have to do things about Russia and there's no negotiating with Russia, but that's not true. We had this article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com from June 8th. Russian officials say Ukraine was ready to sign peace deal early in the war but gave up due to U.S. pressure. The Russian Security Council secretary said Thursday that Ukraine was ready to sign a peace deal with Russia in the early days of the war, but gave up on negotiations due to U.S. pressure. And look, if it had just been a Russian official saying this, I think we wouldn't be talking about it too much on this show, because Russian officials say a lot of things that I don't talk about because there has to be another level of proof, or it really is just Kremlin propaganda. But we do know from Turkey that we had the Turkish foreign minister who was a part of these negotiations saying that there were parties involved that were looking to squash the negotiations. We've heard from the Israeli prime minister, former prime minister Naftali Bennett, who was trying to mediate talks, saying that the U.S. and its allies blocked the Israeli-led mediation efforts. We've had reports in Ukrainian outlets that say Boris Johnson, the then prime minister of the UK, showed up in Kiev and discouraged Zelensky from participating in talks. We've had Fiona Hill, who's a rabid anti-China hawk, come out and say that this deal was on the table as well. So we've heard from so many different parties. It's pretty clear that the West did prevent the talks from happening. And we really should be asking, because so many people who are tied to the reins of power right now in the West, who are making the decisions to end this war, have financial benefits that they are reaping from their former employers and things like that, by selling weapons to Ukraine, or selling weapons to their own government that they then give to Ukraine. We really should be raising a lot of questions there. All right, so I thought this was really interesting, so I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute. NATO members are continuing to trade with Russia despite sanctions. 2 recent reports have uncovered billions in trade between members of the North Atlantic Alliance and Russia since the Kremlin ordered the invasion of Ukraine last year. CoRisk, a Norwegian risk management firm, issued a report in May, and they've released 6 of these reports now. One every, 3 months, every quarter. And what these reports do, and what this firm does, is they are apparently try to put out to European companies that they run the risk of violating sanctions. And so they look at not only trade going directly from the West to Russia, but trade that goes through a third country. And so this is from the executive summary of the report. This report presents total estimates of Western circumvention of sanctions against Russia through a combination of top-down and bottom-up methodology approaches. We estimate that an indirect trade assisting Western countries with Russia at 8 billion euros of indirect exports via third countries, and the indirect exports at 6 billion euros indirect imports at 6 billion euros via third countries in 2022. So Corisk, the Norwegian firm, believes that third-party countries are used to circumvent sanctions on Moscow. And so they kind of say, why else would you send goods to Kazakhstan and then have them re-shipped to Russia? You would just send them directly to Russia unless you were looking to circumvent sanctions. So a quote from the report: "This means that indirect exports largely likely to be circumventing sanctions represented almost 1/5 of all Western exports to Russia." It continued, the report continues here. The main Western countries behind most of the indirect exports to Russia in 2022 were Germany at 2.5 billion euros, Lithuania at 1.45 billion, the United States at 980 million, Poland at 725 million. Again, these are all euros, so a little bit more. Japan at 575, Czech Republic 490 million, France 400 million, Netherlands 290 million. The second study I covered was conducted by the Atlantic Council, and it accuses Turkey of acting as a critical economic lifeline for Russia. And this is from the Atlantic Council report. Although Turkish exports of electronic machinery, including critical integrated circuits, fell in the immediate aftermath of the Russian full-scale invasion, they have since recovered and grown well beyond the pre-invasion average. From March 2022 to March 2023, Turkish electronic exports to Russia jumped by 85%. It added that Turkey's trade with Russia remains a vital economic lifeline for its businesses as the country recovers and reconstructs from a devastating earthquake earlier this year. After Russia invaded Ukraine last year, President Joe Biden pledged to cripple the Russian economy with a sanctions package the White House compared to an economic nuclear weapon. Part of the reason the economic war has failed to harm Moscow's ability to wage war in Ukraine is that the global community has largely refused to comply with the Western sanctions. The participants in the economic war are limited to Washington and its close allies. The Atlantic Council, a group funded by the US and UK governments, acknowledges that refusal to enforce sanctions is not a condition condoning the war in Ukraine. So, they're saying that, look, Turkey violating sanctions isn't because Ankara supports Russia and wants Russia to kill Ukrainians. It's just what they're doing what's best for their country. So that the report says, such surges in trade, however, are not necessarily indicators of support for the war. Instead, it is more likely that they are predominantly a result of companies and countries pursuing legal opportunities for cheaper exports and new gaps in the Russian market. So I think it's kind of important for a U.S. funded organization to make a note like that, because there's really this portrayal in the West of anybody who doesn't go along with what the West wants in their economic war. So Lula da Silva in Brazil, or Xi in China, or Modi in India. All these leaders are accused of not doing enough to hurt Russia and thereby supporting the Russian war effort. And we have the Atlantic Council saying that, these countries are just doing what's best for them. But interesting that so much of the trade still going to Russia is coming from the U.S. and its partners. All right, next up here, Sweden will allow NATO deployments in signal to Russia. I wrote this for the antiwar.com on June 9th. Stockholm plans to send a signal to Russia by allowing NATO troop deployments in Sweden before the country is admitted into the alliance, according to top officials. Turkey is holding up Sweden's bid to join the bloc. The Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Sweden announced that its military would step up preparations with NATO in an article published in a Swedish outlet on Friday. The preparations may consist of temporary basing of foreign equipment and personnel on Swedish territory. The decision sends a clear signal to Russia and strengthens Sweden's defenses. The joint operations send a clear signal to Russia that our ability to give and receive military aid is good. the officials wrote in the op-ed. On Thursday, the Wall Street Journal reported Swedish and Finnish militaries were rapidly integrating into the alliance due to a campaign by internationalist officials who were to integrate the Nordic states into the bloc despite public opposition. And this is a quote from the Wall Street Journal article. Behind the long-standing public resistance was a meticulous, decades-long campaign of preparation by internationalist officials who since the 1990s sought to move their countries as close to the alliance as the domestic public opinion, dead set against full membership, would allow. And I'm sure Russia is aware of this, and it's probably part of the reason why the Russians haven't been as irate about, say, Sweden joining, Finland joining the North Atlantic Alliance, even though Finland joining in particular, that double the border between NATO and Russia, is because it's long been the case that these countries are kind of de facto members of the alliance. I guess not quite. Now Sweden is, I guess, a de facto member of the alliance with announcing these troop deployments, but they've always hosted war games and things like that. So the article explained that by the time public and political support last year swung behind joining NATO, the Swedish and Finnish militaries had streamlined to NATO standards through participating in joint missions for 30 years. Last year, Sweden and Finland broke their long-standing policy of neutrality and formally applied to join the North Atlantic Alliance. Their bid met stiff opposition from Turkey, which believes the Nordic states provide too much support for Kurdish groups that Ankara labels as terrorist organizations. A trilateral pact between Ankara, Stockholm, and Helsinki led to Turkey lifting its opposition to Finland's membership. However, Ankara says that Stockholm has refused to comply with the agreement and is still preventing Sweden from joining the bloc. Last week, Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, civilian head of NATO, did mention that, he thinks talks can work this out, but it doesn't seem like those talks are really on the horizon here. I don't think that it's going to happen in the next month before the big NATO summit in July, and that's in Lithuania. Russian officials have said that Moscow will respond to NATO expanding its presence in Finland and Sweden. In December, the Russian defense minister said that given NATO's desire to increase its military potential near Russian borders, as well as to extend the alliance by adding Finland and Sweden, it's necessary to take retaliatory measures and to create an appropriate grouping of troops in northwest Russia. The Washington-led alliance believes Sweden becoming a member will significantly change the political dynamics in the region. If Sweden and Finland join, it could turn the Baltic Sea into an, quote, inner sea of NATO, according to the Ukrainian defense minister. All right, next up here is an article that Connor Freeman, the co-host of the show, wrote for the antiwar.com last week. White House says Iran is helping Russia build a drone factory. As a part of the, quote, deepening military partnership between Iran and Russia amid the war in Ukraine, the U.S. intelligence community believes Tehran is assisting Moscow in building a drone manufacturing plant that may be operational next year, the White House said on Friday. American officials claim hundreds of Iranian drones were transported to Russia via the Caspian Sea last month. The drones that are shipped across the Caspian Sea from Iran to Russia and used operationally by Russian forces against Ukraine, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said, as of May, Russia received hundreds of one-way attack unmanned aerial vehicles as well as UAV production-related equipment from Iran. The Islamic Republic insists that it has not provided drones to Russia since the Kremlin launched its invasion last year. According to Kirby, the alleged drone factory will be built in the special economic zone of the Russian Republic of Tatarstan. The White House released a satellite photo that purportedly shows an industrial site 600 miles east of Moscow, where Russia will probably, according to the White House, conduct the domestic production of Iranian-designed UAVs. Tehran is said to be providing materials necessary for building the plant as well. The extent of the evidence presented in this photograph and a color-coded map showing the ostensible shipping routes from Iran to Russia across the Caspian Sea. And so we've had these reports go on for the entire war that Iran was providing a lot of assistance to Russia. I guess I wouldn't be entirely surprised if Iran was supporting Russia to an extent greater than Tehran was willing to admit at this point. If you look at how dynamics have played out in the world with the U.S. leaving the Iran nuclear agreement under Trump and then Biden refusing to get back into it, Iran may, I think, reasonably assess that it will never be able to really re-enter the Western fold. And so if that's the case, it may be more beneficial to provide military support to Russia, kind of in a morals be damned situation. Now, I'm not sure how the Iranian government feels about it. Maybe they do feel it's an unwarranted and illegal invasion, and that's why they have restrained to some extent their support to Moscow. I'm not sure. It is interesting that this report is coming out, as Connor Freeman talked about on the show last week. The U.S. is apparently moving forward with negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal, and that they were getting close to an agreement. And so this seems like the kind of news that's almost meant to interfere with the Biden administration, with the White House successfully negotiating an agreement with Iran, because this is going to really up the political price that Biden will pay for signing, returning to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Now, I know that in reality that re-entering into this deal would be a good thing. However, I'm sure the assessment from Washington is the more heat they get from the Republicans on the Iran nuclear deal, that's bad. And so I think that's the calculation that somebody is trying to get Biden to make here, that this just isn't the time that we could talk with the Iranians. That's what the Republicans love to say. And so I'm sure this deal is going to kind of advance, or that report is going to advance that narrative. I'm not sure if it's true. Right. My guess is that it's very possible that had Russia had a bunch of Iranian drones already, they could have reverse engineered them, or the Iranians could have, not necessarily hindered the Russians and, give them little bits of knowledge and nuggets, or little, nuggets of knowledge here or there to, kind of help them increase any hurdles to design their drones. But, that's not exactly what the U.S. is describing. And so the support for that Iran gives Russia is probably far more nuanced than that particular report portrays. All right, let's move on here. Talk about some stuff going on between the U.S. and China. Pentagon, White House dismiss Wall Street Journal report on Chinese spy station in Cuba, calling it not accurate. The Pentagon on Thursday dismissed a report from the Wall Street Journal that claimed Beijing and Havana have reached an agreement in principle on China establishing a secret spy facility in Cuba. When asked about the report, Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Patrick Ryder said it was inaccurate. I can tell you based on the information that we have that this is not accurate, that we are not aware of China and Cuba developing a new type of spy station. In terms of that particular report, no, it's not accurate. Again, this is something that could happen. China could have relations with Cuba and set up different agencies on the island. That probably does happen. That probably will happen. At the same time, you do have to ask why the reports are coming out when they are, because there's usually a political motivation for it. And so I know there has been some pressure from Democrat senators for the Biden administration to roll back to the Obama era policy and have a little bit of normalizing relations with Cuba. But it doesn't seem like the White House is very interested in that, at least not so far. Although I'm sure, the Republicans, particularly in Florida, will see this as a lot of red meat and will, kind of throw this at the White House. Not only is Cuba bad for just being Cuba, but now they're bad because, oh, look, they're helping the Chinese just like they helped the Soviets. This story, doesn't sound particularly interesting, but it's the kind of thing that in the long run will probably turn out to be a relatively big deal and really upset Beijing, US, Taiwan, Japan to share real-time drone surveillance data. The US, Japan, and Taiwan are preparing to share real-time data from NATO's naval surveillance drones in a move sure to anger China, the Financial Times reported on Thursday. General Atomics is due to deliver 4 MQ-9B Guardian drones to Taiwan in early 2025. It's a version of the Reaper drone for the sea, which the U.S. has used to launch airstrikes across the Middle East and Africa. Sources told the Financial Times that the U.S. will allow Taiwan to integrate the drones into the same system that the U.S. and Japanese militaries use in the region, allowing real-time data sharing. All right. I think that's what I have for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And, again, helping the show to grow, helping us to get it out there to more people. So, again, if you could, it's on YouTube, Rumble, Odysee. I post every show on every one of those sites. That way everybody could, catch it if you're banned from a particular site, or if we end up getting banned from somewhere. We do already have a warning from YouTube. We actually appealed and won against the strike. So, at least so far we've been able to stay up on that platform, but it does seem like the censorship is ramping up there again, especially as we touch on another election season here. So, if you really like watching the show, if you have a Rumble, if you have an Odysee, go ahead and subscribe to the show, even if you prefer to watch it at YouTube still, just in case we do end up getting taken down. I'm on Twitter at KYAAA. No, that's not my Twitter. I'd say at KyleAnsloan_ now. That was the old Twitter handle. You can also find the show on its Twitter at con_interest. And then it's at the Institute and antiwar.com. Thanks, everyone.